Alumni from the University of Pretoria under the banner LeadUP will engage in a post-budget debate on the 25th of June, asking the question, is the COVID-19 economic stimulus plan enough to reconstruct the economy? Looking ahead to the conversation, we're joined now online by Economist and Director for the Centre of Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule. A very good morning to you, Mr. Gqubule, and thank you so much for making the time. So since this is a debate, perhaps let me start by asking just the LEAD alumni, how is this formulated? Who comes in to speak and how does this work?
The way I understand it, it's a regular thought leadership series that the alumni have, and they invite outside speakers and people who are at the university to discuss issues of national importance. Yeah.
So where do you stand in terms of the question, in terms of whether the stimulus package is enough?
Well, the stimulus package was announced. The stimulus package was announced with a headline figure of about 500 billion rands. But if you cut through the smoke and mirrors, you realize that the net contribution by National Treasury is about 71 billion rands, according to my calculation. That is only 1.4% of GDP. And what you must remember is that before COVID-19, South Africa had its two consecutive recessions. 2 recessions in 2 consecutive years. And we were heading towards a 3rd recession in 3 consecutive years. So the response from fiscal policy and monetary policy, where we've seen 275 basis points cuts in interest rates, would not have been enough for the previous crisis before COVID. Now, what we're seeing with COVID is the biggest depression in more than a century. And I believe that our policymakers, the central bank and the National Treasury, they're way behind the policy curve in terms of the amazing innovation that you've seen in countries throughout the world. You can just go through country after country, and there are so many models that, whether it's in Asia or in the advanced countries or countries that are similar to us like Malaysia, Thailand and so forth. There's so much to learn in terms of what countries have done. And I have to say one point. I know that's not the focus of the discussion. Today, we now see 5,000 new cases of COVID in South Africa today. And that is way too high. And it is showing that we have not got the medical response correct, let alone the economic response. And we've overtaken China in terms of total cases. China with a population of 1.4 billion people, and we with a population of 58 million people. And if you compare us with similar countries like South Korea, they've got 12,000 cases. We are 92,000 cases. So we are 7 times more than South Korea, which was the first epicenter of the disease outside of China. And if you look at Japan, which has got more than double our population, they've got 19,000 cases. And they were also exposed to this very early because of their close ties and proximity to China. So I think that on the medical side and the economic side, our response hasn't been adequate.
So where do you reckon the rest of the 429 billion will be coming from? We were having a conversation earlier on the show with the Chief Executive Officer of Rand Water, where they were saying that they're expecting an allocation of about 600 million rands from the Department of Education, and yet they're only sitting at 200, which means there are shortfalls there. Where are the rest of the money is going to be coming from?
Okay, first of all, I have to explain that there is no 500 billion. First of all, I have to explain there is no 500 billion. Let's unpack it. There was 200 billion for a loan scheme. Now, it has come out that the actual commitment that has been made was 100 billion, not 200 billion. And then it has come up that the take-up of these loans has been so low, so there is no 100 billion rand that has come from anywhere. So if you unpack the rest of it, the rest of the stimulus package, the UIF has spent about 20 billion rands and providing unemployment benefits. And if you look at the direct government contribution, most of it was going to come from the reprioritization of existing spending. And a stimulus is the injection of new money into the economy. So the reprioritization of existing spending should not count as a stimulus. So what I'm trying to say is that what the government is saying in terms of their presentation to Parliament on April 30 is that they'll be borrowing about 95 billion rands from the IMF and the World Bank. And you must remember that the currency has been appreciating since then. So it's no longer 95 million rands. It's probably around 70 billion rands from the IMF. And that is it's only a small portion of our GDP. It will not make a difference here.
And already there's reports that is it 100, the new development bank to loan South Africa $1 billion US. How does this add to the confusion?
No, this was part of the 95 billion rands that was announced in Parliament on the 30th. It's not new. They had announced all this from the New Development Bank, the World Bank, and the IMF. This was money that would part finance the government. But you must remember that our budget deficit will increase to 14% of GDP. The budget deficit in value will be about 750 billion rands, double what was budgeted for. So 100 billion rands. It's less than 100 billion rands. All these loan facilities will be about 10% of the budget deficit. So this calls upon the central bank, the Reserve Bank, and the Public Investment Corporation to support the funding of the 700 billion rands budget deficit.
The question you're asking deals with an important question which is not related to COVID-19, which asks, will this help to develop the economy? One of the big stories this week was the taxi associations complaining that the 1 billion rand allocated to them by the Minister of Transport is not sufficient. According to your studies, what's a fair spread? Which sectors were more affected and which sectors need to be prioritized?
I think there's general agreement that the service industries, like your restaurants, your taxis, are the most affected, and quite frankly, artists and so forth. Yeah, but quite frankly, the response. I saw one statistic that the Department of Small Business Development helped 1,500 businesses. Now, because government wasn't prepared to offer proper relief to the companies that had been affected, there was no option but to reduce the lockdown, as I was saying, because government was not providing any humanitarian relief for any of the affected sectors. Now, the 1 billion rand for the taxes is 5,000 to the taxi industry whatsoever. Yeah.
So when money is allocated to a particular sector, how again do we break down which areas it should go into? Should it go into administration? Should it go into the most affected entrepreneurs who are not making an income? How do we make these decisions?
Well, I'm not sure how they're going to make these decisions in this case, but I was just assuming that it goes equally to all taxi operators and they would get about 5,000 each. But the point is, and what about the restaurants? They employ about 800,000 people. There needs to be some kind of support for them because most of them are not making money with the online sales. And then obviously in a couple of weeks, they'll be allowed to sit down, but under conditions. So they won't be at full capacity when we open up, let's say, in a couple of weeks. So I do believe that we're supposed... Now, in terms of the design of a stimulus package, if you look at the global packages, most of them first focus on households. For example, the Malaysian stimulus, 50% of it, 17% of GDP, went to households. Then the second portion of it is to protect the people who are already in work, people who've been temporarily laid off, something similar to what the UIF is doing. Now, the third component of a stimulus package is support to businesses. And generally, the packages throughout the world, you have an instrument supported by Treasury for small businesses, and then an instrument supported by the central bank for large businesses, as you've seen in the UK and you've seen in the Federal Reserve. So we don't have many of these facilities. And in that way, that's what I mean when I say our response has not been adequate.
Conversation with Economist and Director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule, but we're going to bring into the conversation now the Principal and VC of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe. Thank you so much for making the time, Professor Kupe. Mr. Gqubule was telling us about LeadUP and how it's a think tank that meets regularly. This is quite an important time for conversations to be coming up of such think tanks. And what does the university or institution hope to come out of this particular conversation at a time when we're in need of answers?
No, I think that it's a time of great anxiety for everybody, given the impacts of COVID on the economy and many sectors of our society, including the universities. We're a public institution and a public university. And public institutions and universities should promote public debate on policy matters and government programs to improve the life of everyone and also to create the kind of economy that we want. So really, we are providing a platform for public debates from different points of view, which we hope will feed into the policy making by our government and other players in the economy and other players in society more generally. It also provides an educational platform for our students to hear the experts out there, learn, speak about the things in concrete terms that they read about in textbooks and in theories.
How do you hope it will feed into policy making in terms of government?
Well, this is, for example, the SABC is a public broadcaster, and the platform we are providing is their platform during these days of COVID. We hope they take note, they listen, and also in crafting whatever programs they craft in order to reconstruct our economy, they take note of what the experts say and the interactions. Remember, what is going to happen also is that we're going to allow on that platform a lot of questions to come from the public anywhere at any point, and also through the chat lines. I often notice that the ministers of finance often ask for tips, Tito's tips, it was Trevor's tips in the past or Pravin's tips in the past. And they claim that those tips fit into what the programs that they actually craft. But just enriching the public debate and the public discourse with different points of view is what makes a democracy, and it's what makes for transparency, and it's what makes for accountability.
Mr. Gqubule, let me get back to you, just taking forward the conversation we've been having so far. One of the impacts of COVID-19 has been the exponential growth of electronic business. How will this impact the type of amounts in terms of relief that businesses will be requiring from government?
You see, the unfortunate thing about COVID, it shines the spotlights into the inequalities of our society. So what you're seeing in the education system is that the people who have online facilities in the private schools, they are continuing with education unaffected, but the people within the public schools, they are not continuing with their education. It's going to be a big challenge to have them come back to classes. So in all areas of society, so I think that the whole issue that's going to come out of this is broadband a public good? Do we have to provide it like in countries like South Korea, subsidized for the whole country? These are some of the debates that we should be having, and because it's unacceptable that the children in poor societies who don't have access to what you call broadband in their homes and in their schools should be expected to go to crowded schools to continue learning. And those are some of the things that we have to decide and address and attack at the moment here.
Let's talk about the state-owned enterprises and the machinations they continue to go through that are not getting any better as we go through the COVID period. How will this be impacted by the stimulus package, this space of our society? Mr. Gqubule.
Yes, the Eskom crisis has been with us for a long time, before COVID. So the government hasn't really provided adequate financial support to Eskom because the balance sheet of Eskom is unsustainable. They've got debt of probably 500 billion. And obviously, the revenues of Eskom will be impacted by this COVID crisis. So their situation is going to get worse. And obviously, we've heard about what's happening with SAA. It's a massive, massive crisis. But we haven't seen proper answers from the government. We've just seen fighting between the business rescue practitioners and between the Department of Public Enterprises. But the workers, all the people that are affected, can't see the way forward. What is the future for this enterprise? Is there going to be a new SAA? We are in the dark. And I think that it's about time that the government becomes more transparent about what they should do. Now, Eskom, we've had no load shedding since the start of this thing. But now we've heard where it's because of the lack of demand. But it's a problem that's going to get worse over the next months. Yeah.
Professor Kupe, when you bring the stimulus conversation down to one institution. Just give us a sense of how the University of Pretoria has been interacting with both the Department of Higher Education and Treasury in terms of the things that can be done to ensure that the curriculum continues at UP.
Yeah, so in relation to, of course, the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is our parent ministry and department, if you like, we've fed a lot into continuity plans for teaching and learning. We've gone very much online. We've interacted with them very much around what our plans are and what we need. We also have worked very closely with them about repurposing budgets in order, for example, to afford devices for students. So we've repurposed our own budgets. We've discussed with them some of the grants that they give us. They've spoken to Treasury. And in that space, what is going to happen is that we will receive some COVID-related ring-fenced grants that we can use to ensure that we save the academic year at the same time saving lives. Also, our Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences has created a portal for small to medium enterprises, especially the ones that are distressed, where we pull some kind of advice for them, and then they can interact with that. There's been a phenomenal response to this portal, and I think we will continue. So one of the debates we held, these online panels we held, like one we're going to hold on the budget, pre-budget day on the 23rd, post-budget day on the 25th, was one on business rescue and how you deal with business rescue. And it was also very well subscribed, and a lot of people owning businesses in distress wanted to hear from the panel of experts, many of who are at University of Pretoria, how you go about the process of business rescue and what it actually means for you. So as a university, what we're trying to do is to say, for a public university, we're in this together with various sectors of society. When it comes to the economy, we're deeply interested because the students that we produce go back into society, into the economy as employees, as actors, and even people who want to create their own businesses. And so we can't be a standby people, reading textbooks, reading theories, and discussing among ourselves. We are actors in society, and will also, in a sense, provide all of the knowledge we have, but we recognize there's also knowledge out there. That is why when people like Mr. Gqubule, Dr. Tabili Yoka, Ms. Mabuza on this panel, Andy Kumalo, entrepreneur and manager, as well as people from Brand SA, we want to bring all of that, the sharp talents, the insights, to actually, in a sense, help society get out of this economic wasteland that we are facing.
Mr. Gqubule, we were talking earlier about how most of the sources of the stimulus package will be loans. And you know how they say you shouldn't get debt to pay off debt. Will this put South Africa in a good position?
No, the very small part of a small part of the stimulus, it's less than 90 billion rand, is new loans of the 500 billion. So the majority of it is the reprioritization of existing spending, which is not technically a proper stimulus. And then some of it is also doesn't sit on the government balance sheet. It's loans that the banks will give. So a very small portion is new lending by the government. But despite that, the collapse in tax revenue will result in a doubling of the budget deficit to around 750 billion rand. So the bigger damage to our economy is the collapse of the economy and the collapse of tax revenue, which will result in a huge budget deficit of about 750 billion rands.
When the president announced the stimulus, he made it very clear that there will be zero tolerance for corruption. And this week we saw the law enforcement agencies go after perceived previous corruption against the state. How will this conversation blend into your conversation about trying to revive the economy?
Yes, of course. Over the past decade, we had this huge issues of state capture, which was absolutely so distressing. And obviously, the government is cleaning up its act, and we need to make sure that when the money is allocated, the people receive the money. But we're seeing continued stories of money not received. People around the issues of the water tanks, around the PPEs, and the government really has to I think there has to be more transparency in public procurement. And whenever you see an emergency public procurement procedure, you must know that it could result in such corruption. So we shouldn't allow all these emergency procurement. We should have transparent procurement in the public sector, even if it delays delivery, to make sure that the money gets to the people who are supposed to receive it.
Gentlemen, as I wish you well for your conversation on the 25th, let me ask you both a similar question. I think I've already asked the professor in a bit, in terms of how you hope the outcomes of this conversation will help in finding solutions for both COVID-19 and for reviving the South African economy. Let's start with you, Professor.
So I think there's already ongoing debates that are happening around, for example, what people call the new normal, which is an unfortunate phrase because the normal was not what we want. It's not the society we want to have, which doesn't have such a depth of inequality, such high levels of unemployment and poverty, and an economy that is not as industrialized as it should be, and that is not as modernized in relation to the use of new technology as we would want. So we hope that these debates are also going to kickstart a conversation about what it will take to create the society that we want, which is where there is not such high levels of inequality and preferably no inequality, where poverty is not the order of the day, where youth unemployment, as I hear from the experts, is around 50%, if not higher, where we create, if you like, an economy that caters for all, an economy that is able to mobilize the potential that we have in terms of the natural resources we have, of course, being an economy on the continent and globally connected, and also an economy that, if you like, does not waste the potential of our youth, does not waste the potential of our women, in a sense, convince all of the capabilities and the potential for us. Because we could be a prosperous, democratic, equal, equitable society that is actually sustainable and uses resources in a manner which is forward-looking and future-oriented. At the University of Pretoria, we've constructed recently very many institutes. Future Africa Institute is one institute that is doing this Engineering 4.0, about future-oriented, smart transportation, well-resourced, well-managed, digitally driven, forward-looking, driving a powerful continental economy. We are now also constructing an institute for smart precision agriculture for the 21st century. Again, sustainable, aware of the climate crisis and emergencies that we face, and driving an economy that is equal and equitable and so on. So we really, this is part of a long journey, if you like, to creating the kind of society that we all aspire for, just equitable, prosperous, and democratic.
Gqubule, how do you hope the conversation will impact decisions?
Yeah, I agree with the professor. We have to reimagine a new society with less levels of inequality. So what this crisis has done, it's shown the spot. It's taken all our pre-existing economic problems and put fast forward on every one of them. So I would like to see a dignity floor below which no South African will fall. And the elements of that dignity floor will be, number one, a basic income grant for the people who are between ages of 18 and 59 to make sure that they're not as exposed as they were during these violent and sudden decline, global financial crisis. The second issue I would like to see is the acceleration of the national health insurance that we've been talking about for many years. I think the government has to have a united, we have to merge the two health systems that are driving the inequalities in our society. And we also have to merge the two basic education systems, where you have one education system for the rich who are doing online learning and one for the poor people who can't do online learning. So those are some of the things that I would like to do. And in terms of the industrialization of our country, we have to have a Green New Deal for South Africa that drives the infrastructure spending. So this stimulus package, it must have elements that drive the future industrialization of a green economy, and also provide more social protection for South Africans. So the next time we have a crisis, because these crises of global capitalism are very frequent, they're not black swan events. Next year, it could be a commodity crisis. The following year could be a global financial crisis. It could be a climate crisis the next year. So we cannot continue to have our people exposed to these crises of global capitalism.
Let me thank both of you once again for talking to us. The conversation takes place on Tuesday, the 23rd of June at 6 p.m. South African time. It's by LeadUP, Alumni Thought Leadership, and the participants will be Dr. Tawana, an economist, Ms. Busisiwe Mabuza, chairperson of the Industrial Development Corporation, Mr. Andile Khumalo, investor and entrepreneur, Dr. Petrus de Kock, who is the general manager research at Brand South Africa, and of course, Mr. Duma Gqubule, who's the director at the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. Just a quick one, Professor. If the public wants to take part, how do they join the link?
So there is a link with those complicated combinations of letters that I can't mention online. But on our website, there is prominently displayed on the open website where you can actually link. It's free and you can link. Remember also, it doesn't end on the 23rd. On the 25th, there is an analysis of the adjustment budget along the same framework as the topic today, economic stimulus plan. Is it sufficient for reconstruction of the economy? It's actually a 2-day event. So it's what they call a festival of ideas, and may all enjoy it.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much once again for talking to us, Duma Gqubule and Professor Tawana Kupe. You're watching The Agenda. Let's take a break.